So my name is Rose Kent, and I am an author from upstate New York. I write children's novels. I write about all kinds of different kids, different characters. I've done a lot of different things in addition to writing. Prior to that, I was an officer in the Navy, and then I worked for a food company for many years before I started writing for kids. Chi and Calamari is the story of a middle school age boy named Joseph. Joseph is he's Korean. He is in an adopted family that is Italian American, and he's kind of a wisecracker, joker. He likes to say that he's Korean on the outside, Italian on the inside, and sometimes the other way around. He's also your typical middle school kid. He's a drummer in the band. He loves Spider-Man. He loves comic books. He's got a crush in school. But things kind of come to trouble for Joseph when he finds out that he has to write an essay on his ancestors, which would certainly be hard for an adopted child. And that kind of leads to a search for his Korean roots. And it's something that's dear to me because I have adopted children, so I understand a little bit about some of the struggles they face in terms of their identity. I think it is a struggle. I think it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge for everybody in the process, for adoptive parents, for adoptees certainly, because in America we're all American, and yet we're really not a melting pot. We all have our own ethnic identities, and I think it's even more challenging for adopted kids because they can't look to their parents to get that knowledge that they might get if their parents were immigrants, for example. Their adopted parents, what I'm talking about. So I think it's a situation where kids really have to learn about their culture, and it's really the responsibility of adoptive parents to help them find that way, to find out about their culture. And in Joseph's case, in my book, he's Korean, so it involves more knowledge about the Korean community, about what that means to be Korean. And sometimes people want to boil adoption down to the search for a birth parent, and that's very important to kids, who their birth parents are, but I think it's even broader than that for a lot of kids. So I think you see some of those struggle issues in the book, and I think adoptees, and I've spoken to so many of them, I think that this is something that they kind of struggle with for life, and it certainly doesn't mean that it dooms them and that they're sad all the time about this, but I think it's fair to say there's some loss issues surrounding adoption, that even as an adoptive parent you can't just dismiss and say, well, I love my kids, they're going to be fine. That we have to acknowledge and allow them to express them. And that really came right from doing a lot of talking with adoptees. When I first started writing this book, my adopted children were very young, so I spoke to even older children who could maybe express themselves a little bit more, middle school age and high school. And they talked about this feeling, particularly I spoke with Korean adoptees, I spoke with some Chinese adoptees, transracial adoptees, and they talked about this feeling that they did feel they were part of their family, their adoptive family. They felt that family was real, they knew there was love there. But when they would see somebody from their birth culture in a setting, eating their traditional cultural food or at some event, they didn't feel real. They felt like they didn't have this authentic stamp on them. So there's that sort of like that struggle. Joseph jokingly calls it a sandwich. He feels like a sandwich. And I think it's something that people can work on helping with if they get the opportunity to learn more about their culture. And when you're talking about kids, that really goes back to the parents really helping them get that knowledge. I have a big family, a blended family. I have stepchildren, I have adopted children, I have biological children, so I kind of have it all. I call it this like big life stew that I have, and it always, my family informs my writing informs my family. It's all mixed together to me. But it was something that really inspired me to start writing this book when my adopted kids were really very, very young, because I was one of those moms who always went to the library and schlepped around with a big bag of books, and I was always looking for books that my kids could connect to with adopted characters, and I didn't find enough of them. I found some, but I wanted more, and ideally I would have loved books written by adoptees. And that's when I finally decided I want to touch on some of these topics. And I know from having spoken to so many parents that sometimes a book, particularly a piece of fiction, is really a safe way to do that with kids. Rather than sit there and give them the lecture and tell them, this and that. They read a story about a character that they can relate to. It helps them see some of the things that you really want to talk about with them too. I like to throw out the word serendipity when I think about my writing process, because it's not it's not a very clear-cut process where I decide I'm going to write about this, and then I outline it, and I go and do it, and it all works out. So many happy accidents fall along the way. I usually start with character. When I was thinking about this story, I knew I wanted to write about a Korean adopted boy. I just knew that right away, so I took some time to get to know the character. And then often what happens is the character leads me to the story. I have a general sense of where I want to go with it, but I make so many mistakes along the way, and I feel like sometimes if I'm in a car driving, I drive off the road and get lost. And sometimes I'll write for 30, 40, 50 pages and realize, nope, I went the wrong way there, and I come back. But I don't see it as waste, because there's learning that you get along the way about your character that comes back and puts you back on the right road. And as I said, the serendipity, happy accidents along the way. I'll make a discovery along the way that will really inform the story. I wanted to bring superstition into the story, because there's a whole piece where Joseph's adopted family is Italian, and they have roots to the Italian culture, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And I knew I wanted to start the story that Joseph would get something that would set off this struggle with his identity. So I wanted it to be somehow related to his being Italian and superstition, and again, a happy accident. I just so happened to have an 88-year-old grandmother who lives on our street. We call her Nonna, which is Italian for grandmother, and she started telling me about the Malocchio, which is this Italian superstition, old school, about a curse, and if someone looked at you the wrong way, you could get the evil eye, the Malocchio, and that some people would actually wear a kind of like a little pendant around their neck with this horn on it. It looks like a goat's horn that would ward off the Malocchio. Happy accident. I hadn't really planned that, and I thought, gee, that's brilliant. Joseph could get that for his birthday from his Italian dad, who would think, what a great present. And meanwhile, this 14-year-old boy would be like, are you kidding me? I'm Korean, hello. And that would really start the conflict right there. So my process is really driven by happy accidents along the way. I was a really shy kid, and I was one of these kids that read everything. Everything I could. Nancy Drew, I devoured. In the last few years, I guess I should say in the last 10 years, I've really thought so much of Cynthia Rylant. She's a writer that really inspires me. I think one of the first books that I read that really said to me, I want to write for kids, was when I read Missing May, which is a very thin, small, little middle grade book about a girl and really grief and coming to terms with grief. But when I read that and saw how she developed character, how she showed the saying, show, don't tell. It just really turned me around. I said, this is what I want to do. I think the world of Patricia Riley Giff, Newbery winner, so many talented books. I find good writing in so many areas, and oftentimes when I'll talk to kids, I love fiction. I also love nonfiction. I also want to read comic books and cookbooks. I think that there's so many good forms of writing out there for us today, more than ever.